One of my favorite things to study in the Bible is how it actually references itself or how it quotes itself. I think it's really fascinating to try to understand what the biblical authors are doing when they're actually using other biblical material. So today I want to talk to you about three ways the Bible quotes itself. So, first, there's obviously direct quotation, right? And this is when the author signals that the material they're about to write actually comes from somewhere else within the Bible. And we could find a bunch of examples, but here's one from Matthew 2, verses 17 through 18, and Jeremiah 31, verse 15. The author of Matthew is quoting the prophet Jeremiah, and he tells you as much. He says that this fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah, and then he quotes it, right? And so he doesn't give you like the verse number, right? Because that didn't exist in that time period. You just knew the words and you knew where to go and find it in the scroll. And so that's what's happening here. So this is a direct quotation. Now, this is not the only way that the biblical authors do it. Sometimes they won't tell you which prophet or book of the Bible they're grabbing it from. They'll just say something like, as it is written, or spoken by the Lord through the prophet, right? And never identify exactly who it is, but still, these are direct quotations. The author is telling you that he got it from somewhere else. Another example of this happens actually within the Old Testament. So it's not just the New Testament using the Old Testament. Later Old Testament authors use earlier material. The most prevalent example of this happens in the book of Chronicles, which is using um, material from Samuel and Kings. And we could go really far into this topic. It's a really fascinating subject. But you can see just here from 2 Samuel 8, verses 3 through 5, they're quoted almost verbatim in First Chronicles 18, 3 through 5. And in fact, quotation might not quite be the right word. Like the author of Chronicles is just reusing this material. And scholars actually spend a ton of time talking about the small differences and why those differences exist between the Chronicles example and the one we find in Samuel and Kings. That's a conversation for a different day. But what you can clearly see is that the author is obviously using older biblical material to tell his story in Chronicles. And it's a really fascinating area of study. Another way that the Bible quotes itself or references itself is through something called allusion, not illusion like a magic trick, but allusion. And this refers to an implied or indirect reference to some other material. And this is a little bit more difficult and tricky to notice because there's no signal in the text that says, hey, I'm quoting something here. You have to be more familiar with what's happening. Now, an example of this would be if I said something like, this ain't Kansas, right? That can seem like a weird phrase unless you've seen The Wizard of Oz. And then, I'm alluding to, we're not in Kansas anymore, Toto, right? I'm alluding to this whole other movie. And so that's sort of how allusion works. It's not a direct quotation, but it clearly, if you are familiar with the earlier material, you'll catch it. Right. A famous example of this happens in the way that Jesus's birth story is told and Moses's birth story, right? Both of them are have to be protected from this murderous king who's after these children, these Israelite baby boys. And so there's a lot of similarities between these two stories. And that is an example of allusion, right? That the biblical authors are wanting us to make these connections between the text. And I think that's always fascinating when you can notice it. The third is something called an echo. And just as an echo, reverberates off of the wall in a large cave, right? And you sort of hear it sort of fading out. An echo in literary terms can sort of refer to something that's not always intentional, right? It can be an unintentional repetition of an earlier text. And this happens when your imagination is so immersed in the biblical story that the author then just randomly pulls bits and pieces. And it's not always random. There's usually some significance to this, right? But it isn't always on the surface. And you can usually understand the text perfectly fine if you don't catch the reference, right? But there's some repetition of a theme or thought from an earlier passage that becomes important for the one that we're reading. One of my favorite examples of this actually occurs in the book of Kings. So in 2 Kings 4, Elisha is um, ministering or working with this woman from Shunem. She's the Shunammite woman. And what he says to her is actually an echo of what God says to Sarah in Genesis 18, verse 11. And if we read these, you can see these similarities. Elisha says, "At this season and due time, you shall embrace a son." And then in Genesis 18:11, it says, "I will surely return to you in due season, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Right. And so you can see that there's something similar here. And when we expand out, we see that in both stories, we have a woman who doesn't have a male heir with an old husband who can't have a child anymore. And so you can see that these sort of set up a parallel, even though the author never directly quotes anything from Genesis, but he's alluding to it. And there's sort of this echo. It's not as strong as like saying we're not in Kansas anymore, but there's this echo that if you know both stories, you can catch it, right? But you don't have to know it in order to get the significance of this larger story that Elisha is telling. And so that's an example of an echo. And again, you can see that echoes and allusions, they're sort of on a spectrum. They're not completely different, but it's more about how strong it is in the reader's perception. So echoes are easy to miss, though, because they require significant familiarity with the Bible, right? So if you're going to recognize them at all, you've got to immerse your own imagination in the scriptures. And that's how you then begin to see these connections between different parts of the Bible. So here's a reflection question for you. Have you ever studied the Bible as literature? I mean, that's what we're doing when we're talking about these things. Have you ever studied the Bible as literature? And what are the pros and cons of doing that? What are the benefits and what are the potential pitfalls of studying the Bible as literature? I'd love to know your thoughts. You can leave a comment or you could even send me an email and I'd look forward to responding to you. As always, one of the things that I do on my website is a monthly Bible study challenge. And if you're interested in diving deeper into topics like this and working through biblical text, I'd love for you to consider joining one of those. I'll have a link in the description below so you can find out more information.